Well, hello, and welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for listening and watching my videos. I appreciate all the likes and the shares. And if you're new here, thank you for subscribing. We are moving on to chapter 3 of In the Company of Witches. It looks like Miss Brynn is going to do some magic, or try to anyway. So here we go, chapter 33. A cool night breeze carried through the windows above my work table in the main floor of the carriage house, flickering the candles I had placed around the edges. I wrapped my scarf in another loop around my neck as I eyed my handiwork. As far as I could see, I had just about everything I needed, and it was perfectly arranged. I'd like to say my aunts would have approved of my craft, but I knew that wasn't the case. Casting a spell on an entire bloodline by myself, without the help of a coven, was not something they would approve of. Not at all. But I was desperate. The purpose of the enchantment I had in mind was to make the target, or in this case, targets, believe something that wasn't true, that rumors were being spread about them, and not just any rumors, but rumors of their deepest secrets. It was meant to induce paranoia and panic, and hopefully, in this case, prod the real murderer of Constance Graves to make a mistake. Once I had cast the spell, my plan was to go to the house of the person I suspected most and wait for the magic to do its work. The dilemma, of course, was choosing which family member to watch. Out of the four, Rip, Mary, John, and Liz, I was torn between Rip and Liz. I didn't trust Rip for a second. I knew Maureen wasn't exaggerating when she said lying came as easily as breathing for her husband. And out of all the siblings, he seemed to be the most bitter about being cut from his father's will. But then there was Liz. I believed it was her nightgown I saw in Mr. Henderson's security footage, and she was clearly trying to frame Nora for her aunt's death. I couldn't help but wonder what else she was hiding. I wasn't sure if I was making the right call, but in the end, I decided I would go with Liz's house. Overall, she was the better candidate for the spell, as Rip's natural arrogance might protect him from some of the paranoia. Only time would tell if I had chosen correctly. I swept a bit of dust from the counter, sending a spider scuttling to the safety of the wall, and then lit three more candles, placing them in a triangle around the workspace. Time for the spell. I reached for the heavy grimoire. I reached for the heavy grimoire I had brought in from the library, but a sudden flurry of wings in the window forced me back. Dog? I brought a hand to my heart as the crow found his footing. I had not been expecting visitors. Once I had recovered myself, I fixed the bird in my sight. I suppose Gideon sent you? He didn't answer. Not that I had really expected him to. Okay, you can stay, but... I yelped and clutched my chest again as a furry set of claws impaled the bottom ledge of the window frame. Faustus? The cat pulled himself up onto the still beside the dog. They gave each other filthy looks, but then settled in, and turned their attention to me. Wasn't this just terrific? It looked like I was going to have an audience for my first magical performance in, well, forever. Right, fine. You both can stay, but you have to be quiet. Silence. Glad we're agreed. I opened the grimoire and flipped the pages. I knew the spell was in here somewhere. I could almost see it in my mind's eye. It was on the right-hand side of the page, and the edges were bordered with a string of hand-drawn fires. Because grimoires were because grimoires were often personal collections of spells, they didn't usually have a table of contents. But, really, that was something the witching community needed to work on. Then again, I could just use magic to find it. There was a time when my skills were so honed, I could have just snapped my fingers and the book would have opened right to the page. Or I could have called on the night wind to flip through the pages for me until the right one was found. I almost thought about giving that a try, but my neglected skills were not sharp, and I didn't want anything to go wrong before the main event. I turned the page I turned page after page by hand until I finally found it. There you are. Wildfire magic. I traced the words written in calligraphy with my fingertips. When it came to spells, everything needed to be done with care, even the way an incantation was written. For those of us not artistically inclined, it was one of the hardest skills to master. It required so much patience, but most witches believed the powers that be were pleased when great pains were taken to make the words on the page a thing of beauty, and it never hurt to have the powers in a good mood. I read over the words in front of me. The spell had both a potion component and an incantation, but neither was overly complicated. It certainly shouldn't test the limits of my abilities, at least my past abilities. I could do this. I had to. My family needed me. I bent down to retrieve Adam's old Bunsen burner from underneath the table. The last thing I needed for the spell. I blew the dust from it and connected it to the line coming from the wall, being careful to avoid the candles. I then clicked on the gas and cracked the flint lighter above the shooting stream. Faustus hissed when the flame came to life. Sorry, I murmured, fiddling with the gear at the base of the jet. The cat merely licked his paw in response. I slid the burner to the midpoint of the table, then carefully lowered the cooking platform over the top of the flame. Next, the copper pot I had taken from the kitchen. I gingerly placed it on top of the setup, taking time to make sure it was centered. Spilled milk may not be a big deal, but spilled potions were never advisable. I stood back to admire my handiwork. Perfect. Usually a sorry, Using a Bunsen burner wasn't the most romantic way to cook up a spell, but it would have to do. I wasn't about to use the giant cauldron Nora kept hidden in the greenhouse. The only place big enough to operate it was the fire pit in the backyard, and Mr. Henderson might be on the lookout. That would really send him over the edge. I set to grinding the necessary herbs for the spell together with the mortar and pestle, and it didn't take long for them to react to one another. A strange pungent smell came swirling up to my nose. Charcoal, smoke, and just a hint of sulfur. Again, perfect. Next, I needed something to represent the Grace family. I pulled a hair from the comb of Constance that Constance had used, wrapped it around a dried twig I found in one of Nora's many jars. It was from an arbovate tree, Latin for the tree of life. In this case, though, it would stand in for a family tree. I placed the herb and twig into the mini cauldron. Now I needed a base. It could be water, but for this particular spell I had something better. The half of a bottle of prune juice. The last glass from it had been served to Constance. Symbolism was always good in spellcasting. I dumped the contents into the pot and cranked up the flame. A new acidic stench rose from the brew. Burnt prunes, not the most pleasant aroma, but then this wasn't one of Izzy's spells. Darker magic usually was more pungent. I wasn't the only one put off by the scent because the instant my spoon touched the potion to mix it together, Faustus sneezed, making Dog jump. I hid a smile. The potion would need a couple of minutes to simmer, so I sat down to practice the spell, apart from the title. The word had been the words had been updated to modern English, but it was still best to go over them a few times to avoid any mistakes. About 10 minutes later, I gave the bubbling stew a sniff, then drained it through the sieve into a mason jar. There, I said, planting my hands on my hips. That part wasn't so hard. Dog let out a noisy caw. I know, I'm not done. I frowned at the bird. I'm just working myself up to the next part. I let the potion cool in the glass for a minute or two before picking it up. Okay, I plugged my nose. Here goes nothing. I tossed the contents into my mouth and swallowed hard. The liquid burned a path down my stomach. Ugh! My body shuddered. Done. Faustus and Dog looked at me skeptically. Don't worry, this next part will be far more impressive. I rubbed my hands together. Time for the incantation. Here we go, I said, giving my audience a wink before closing my eyes. I had been expecting to feel a tingling of magic running through my veins at this point, but seeing as I could crack concrete without feeling anything, I wasn't too concerned. I clenched my fists by my sides, then cast out the words of the invocation. Winds of night, stoke the fire, blind the sight, fuel the rumors, real or not, grow the fear in every grave's heart, blaze the panic, force the fear, drive out the culpable, bring them near, end the my horrid fascinations churn, in the wildfire the guilty burn. I opened my eyes. A literal cricket sounded in the corner of the garage. Huh. Dog, Faustus, and I exchanged looks. Normally, with these types of spells, something happened right away. I had assumed a telltale rush of power would automatically surge through my body and out into the world. But that certainly hadn't happened. I frowned. I had done the spell correctly. I was sure of it. Granted, I didn't have the help of a coven, but that shouldn't matter for this. I used to be able to handle far more powerful spells. Of course, once again, the key phrase was used to. No, I needed to give it some time. The spell would work. Just as I had thought, out of nowhere, a hot gust of wind hit my shoulders, jolting my body forward and sending my arms flying back. I caught myself before I hit the ground, then spun around looking for the source. But there was nothing to see. Everything was still. In fact, the punch of the wind had come and gone so quickly, it was almost like it had never happened. The only clue left behind was the fur on Faustus' back. It was standing straight up. That was unexpected. The cat gave me a sideways look. I'm sure it's fine. Whatever that was, it's gone. Suddenly, the wind gusted again, sending me spinning in a complete circle. When it stopped, I stood frozen in front of the work table, arms out for balance. Both Dog and Faustus looked quite concerned now. I dropped my arms. Okay. That too was strange. But you saw me do the spell. It went off without a hitch. I had barely gotten the words out when a scorching heat enveloped my feet. It felt like I had been dropped barefoot into blistering hot sand. But there was no sand, and I was not barefoot. The heat was purely magical. I could see the wind this time. It was circling my boots, and along with the dust and dirt it had stirred up from the floor, it was streaked with angry-looking flames. I blinked. A tiny tornado with flaming, mystical winds. The Grimraw hadn't mentioned that as a possibility. A footnote might have been nice. But I could deal with this. What kind of witch was I if I couldn't handle a little heat? I just needed to think this through. Except thinking became almost impossible when the current of fire spinning around me swirled in on itself, tightening and changing its shape. Now it had a sharp peak, and at its front directing its course. A part of me was still clinging to the hope everything was fine, but I knew that wasn't the case. The blazing stream of air circled around and around me, looking like it would never stop. But then it flipped up from the ground and zipped through the air like a rocket. For a moment, I worried it would escape the confines of the garage. But after making one final pass around the room, the sizzling ribbon no- dropped into a nosedive, headed directly for my feet. Oh dear. I let out a squeak as the wind funneled into my toes, racing up my legs into the rest of my body. I tried to breathe, but I couldn't manage anything more than the tiniest gasp of air. This was wrong, very wrong. A, the whole purpose of a spell was to harmoniously bond a witch with her magic for a joint cause. Nothing about this was harmonious. I knew something had to give as my arms and head flung back in a futile attempt to make more room for the powerful swirling inside me. But I didn't know what that something was until my feet left the floor. Uh-oh. Dog and Faustus stared at me with impossibly wide eyes as I rose into the air, higher and higher, until I stopped a few feet off the ground, boots dangling. The blistering hot wind charmed and rolled inside me. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it any more, the magic exploded out, hurling a blast of searing air in all directions. A second later, I dropped to the floor, Faustus's ears flattened against his head, and Dog skittered about on the window ledge as the wind rushed past, extinguishing the candles. I jumped up and ran over to the work table, blinking in the darkness. You guys okay? Dog let out a muted caw while Faustus shot me a horrifying, dirty look before setting into what I knew would be a very thorough bath. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. Dog tilted his head, looking concerned. I'm sure it's fine, I said, fumbling to shut off the gas. My fingers were a little shaky. Granted, it didn't go exactly as expected, but I think my magic was trying to make a point. The spell should be back on track for now. Dog cawed. No, I mean it. It's all good. I turned quickly and stumbled over an old paint can, triggering the bird to flap his wings in alarm. Really, you don't have to worry. I picked my way over to the front of the garage, pushed open the refinished carriage house doors, and then grabbed the handlebars of the bicycle leaning against the wall. Everything is under control. Faustus, who had his face deeply buried in his chest, looked up at me, tongue still hanging out of his mouth. Yeah, I don't believe me either. I swung a leg over my bicycle. I pressed down the pedal and hopped up onto the seat. Hopefully my spell hadn't gotten too much of a head start.